Are mandatory minimums necessary to protect public safety? I'm Simon Harrington, and this is Scholar's Mate. Hello and welcome to Scholar's Mate. I'm your host, Simon Harrington. Mandatory minimum sentences compel judges to issue prison sentences for a minimum number of years for certain crimes. In the 1980s, Congress established tougher sentencing guidelines as part of its effort to tackle the drug problem. Since then, critics of mandatory minimums have worked to repeal them, citing many instances where low-level drug offenders have received unduly harsh sentences. But are these sentences needed to protect the public? Joining us to discuss the issue is Lawrence J. Leiser, founder and current president of the National Association of Assistant U.S. Attorneys. He served as an assistant county prosecutor in New Jersey, an assistant U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia, and as a trial attorney for the Narcotic and Dangerous Drug Section at the U.S. Department of Justice. And joining us via Skype is Kevin Ring, president of Families Against Mandatory Minimums. He served as counsel to the Senate Judiciary's Constitution, Federalism, and Property Rights Subcommittee under the leadership of future U.S. Attorney General John Ashcroft, and as executive director for the Republican Study Committee. He is the author of Scalia's Court, a legacy of landmark opinions and dissents. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
So Lawrence Leiser, could you explain why mandatory minimums are necessary to protect public safety?
Well, first, Simon, I must inform your audience that I am not here today in my capacity as an assistant United States attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia or as a representative for the Department of Justice, and nothing I say should be construed as speaking on their behalf. I am strictly here today in my capacity as president of the National Association of Assistant United States Attorneys, and thank you for having me.
Sure.
Let me very briefly say a word about Assistant United States Attorneys. We are constitutional officers who are sworn to protect and defend our Constitution. We are our nation's federal prosecutors, and as such, our primary job is to protect the innocent while justly and fairly prosecuting the guilty. In a very real sense, we are the gatekeepers of our federal system of justice, which was created to protect the public safety. We work in partnership with the law enforcement agents such as FBI, DEA, ATF, U.S. Marshal Service, and all other federal and state and local law enforcement agencies and departments. We are career professionals who put politics aside and are always committed to following the rule of law regardless of which political party is in power. Mandatory minimum sentencing is not something new. In fact, it began with the United States Congress passing the 1790 Crimes Act, followed by the Sedition Act of 1798 and the Logan Act of 1799, all of which contained mandatory minimum sentences. Today, the majority of convictions under statutes carrying mandatory minimum penalties relate to drug trafficking, firearms, identity theft, sex trafficking, and child sex offenses. Mandatory minimum sentences are Congress's way of trying to protect the public from certain types of criminals committing certain types of crimes. They are not the creation of assistant United States attorneys, but are enacted by the people's representatives in the Congress. As for the so-called low-level drug offenders, at the federal level, we prosecute drug traffickers, not low-level drug offenders. Approximately 4% of federal prosecutions are for drug possession, and half of them occur on our southern borders, where drug couriers are caught carrying 30 to 40 kilograms of marijuana and are pled down to simple possession due to the volume of violators. Not all drug traffickers receive mandatory minimum sentences. First, you have to traffic in a specific amount of drugs. Let's use heroin, for instance. To get a 10-year mandatory sentence, you have to traffic in at least 1 kilogram of heroin. If it is your first offense and you didn't use a firearm, violence, or was not a leader or a manager and cooperated, you would meet the so-called safety valve and get out from under the 10-year mandatory minimum. If you did not meet the safety valve, you could still avoid the 10-year mandatory minimum by cooperating with the government by providing substantial assistance, which often leads to the arrest and prosecution of others up the drug food chain. So if you're trafficking in at least 1 kilogram of heroin with a wholesale value of anywhere from $60,000 to $90,000, do not meet the safety valve criteria and refuse to cooperate with law enforcement, the Congress says you should be significantly punished for trafficking in that amount of heroin to our citizens. If you behave yourself in prison, you will serve about 8.5 years. In light of the safety valve and opportunity to provide substantial assistance, the Congress has determined that mandatory minimum sentences are neither unduly harsh nor inappropriate to protect the public safety. In the end, mandatory minimums will not only help law enforcement stem the tide of illegal drugs, as long as some of our citizens create the market. We will, as a nation, always have the problem and tragedy of illegal drugs and the criminals who want to take advantage for money. Are mandatory sentences needed to protect the public? They sure are.
Thank you. That's quite a statement. Mr. Ring, how do you want to respond to Mr. Leiser?
Well, there was a lot there. I'm going to try to unpack this, and I don't have his speech at the ready, so bear with me.
Sure.
I just want to say, first of all, thank you for having me. I want to thank Larry because I appreciate this type of civil debate. I think anyone around our town knows that the debate's getting out of control when things are becoming personal, and I really like the idea of just having a civil discussion about these topics, even though we disagree so vehemently.
I think that's perfect.
Absolutely.
I just want to say that that was a excellent argument for why drug trafficking is dangerous, why drug use is harmful, why people should be punished for selling drugs, especially deadly drugs, and why families and everyone are right to be concerned about the epidemic of heroin and opioids that's happening right now, which is happening, by the way, without any federal sentencing reform. This is happening on the watch with mandatory minimums in place. But what that argument wasn't is an argument that mandatory minimums are a cost-efficient tool for fighting drug crime. Again, mandatory minimums, as Larry said, were adopted in the late 80s, at least for drugs. These are the most prevalently ones used. Our drug use rate is the same as 1988 as it is today. So they've done zero to reduce drug use. Okay, that was clearly one of the goals. The other thing is when Congress passed these, I think the idea that people had, and Larry said the same, is that they're trying to set a minimum punishment. If you commit crime A, you can be assured that you're going to get 5 years in prison. Or if it's a more serious crime, you're going to get 10 years in prison. That's false. That's for fraud. That's false advertising. Because as Larry knows, what mandatory minimums did was just shift. They're only mandatory on the judges. As a prosecutor, the prosecutor decides who is going to be charged with a crime that carries a mandatory minimum sentence. And so it is not the case that everyone who commits certain crimes are getting the same sentence. There's a prosecutor in Florida who, in cases where somebody shoots a gun into the air, it's called a warning shot. These cases are called warning shot cases. And the person thinks they're acting in self-defense, or maybe they're not. Maybe they're just being reckless. Either way, when they're prosecuted under that state's 1020 life law, which is a mandatory minimum gun statute, again, guns, these are no doubt trying to protect us from danger. When they're prosecuted, many of them plead guilty because they're facing 20 years in prison. Most of the time, though, the prosecutor offers a 3-year plea deal because they know that this person either has a colorable argument of self-defense or just made a mistake. They might otherwise have no criminal history. This is not somebody who's a serious violent offender, but they did commit a crime and they deserve to be held accountable. So they offer a 3-year plea deal. If the person doesn't take it for whatever reason, they think they're innocent or they're just stubborn or whatever it is, they get a 20-year mandatory minimum sentence. One thing should be crystal clear about that. Those extra 17 years have nothing to do with public safety, because if they did, the prosecutor wouldn't offer a 3-year deal. And the politicians who pass mandatory minimums, and they said everyone who commits this act should get 20 years, were deceiving the public when they said that, because routinely prosecutors offer deals for lower sentences. The other thing I want to say is Larry's right that larger quantities are what trigger the higher penalties. But there are so many cases, thanks to conspiracy law, where you are prosecuting people who were not the major traffickers. In 2015, U.S. Sentencing Commission did a study of the 20,000 people who were prosecuted for federal drug crimes. Okay, less than 8% of them were organizers, leaders, managers, or supervisors of their drug conspiracy. Less than 8% of them. 83% didn't have or use a gun. Half of them had little or no criminal history at all. So the question is not whether they've violated the law and whether they've committed crimes and deserve to be held accountable and they should be punished. And it's not whether drugs are good or bad for our society. I'm on Larry's side. They're bad. The question is this a good, effective tool that does justice, or is it one that simply increases the power of prosecutors and cuts out the role that judges are supposed to play in our constitutional system? I'll get to the rest as we go.
Sure. Mr. Leiser, how would you like to respond to
Well,
the
there's several things Kevin said, and it's good to know we agree that drugs are a poison in our society and need to be addressed. One of the things Kevin pointed out is what happens in the state of Florida. Well, the federal government is not a state, and conflating what happens at the state level with the federal level is just unfair. As far as your example about the people that play minor roles in a drug offense, at the federal level, they make the safety valve as their first offense, so they're not getting mandatory minimums, and their role is adjusted under the sentencing guidelines, so they're going to get a 2 or 4 level reduction if they play a minor role, and they're not going to get that they're not going to get that mandatory minimum. Federal prosecutors, as Kevin, I think, knows, are obligated to charge the most serious readily provable offense. We have no discretion unless, in our judgment, we think it would be an injustice to charge that readily provable offense, and then we have to get supervisory approval. So this idea that prosecutors have total discretion to do whatever they want whenever they darn well choose is just not the case. We have to charge the most serious readily provable offense. And Congress passes these statutes with the expectation that we'll do that. They want us to charge these crimes because they believe that the statutes that they pass are a way of solving the problem of drug addiction and drug trafficking in our country. So the idea that the drug rate is the same today as it was 15 to 20 years ago, tragically our people continue to create a market for drug trafficking. It's not the fault of mandatory minimums that nothing much has changed. It's the fault of our citizens who continue to want to use these drugs in the amounts that they do. But for mandatory minimums, you can imagine what the difference would be if the people that we put in jail were out on the streets trafficking in drugs. Mandatory minimums at least keeps them in jail for longer periods of time.
Mr. Ring, how would you like to respond to that last piece that Mr. Leiser just said, that if the mandatories weren't there, then there would be just more use of drugs, illegal drugs, and...
I would love to see any evidence of that. First of all, I want to say, we're talking about mandatory minimums. If he does not think if they operate differently at the state level, okay, well, I'll debate a state prosecutor when you want to have that. But federal prosecutors use them much in the same way. He brought up a recent article about somebody who was just tragically killed. There was an article in the paper today about a prosecutor, assistant U.S. attorney out in Washington State, who was charging somebody a medical marijuana raid. These people were obviously going beyond using it for medical marijuana, and they were involved in a conspiracy. They pled guilty, and then when they went to go to court, they found out that the prosecutor had withheld evidence. And this violates the Constitution and the Supreme Court's decision in Brady. So the defendant said, no, then we're going to withdraw our plea until we can see what that exculpatory evidence was, because we might have gone to trial in that case. And once they asked for that evidence back, the prosecutor filed a superseding indictment to now charge them with 20-year mandatory minimums. What was the public safety benefit of that? Why was that deal all of a sudden taken away and then upped? What was the longer prison term going to do for them? Now, in terms of the longer prison sentences, let's just talk about drugs. Anyone who studied this, conservative or liberal criminologists who study this in terms of drug use, know that drug penalties are not a deterrent. It is swiftness and certainty of being apprehended that deters drug use. It is not length of sentence. Drug traffickers and dealers, especially lower-level people, are not long-term thinkers. They're not cost-benefit analysts. They're not incredibly rational actors. So the idea that they're pouring through the U.S. Code and figuring out that this crime carries 5 years or 10 years and though they're going to change their behavior is folly. And so there's no deterrent effect. The other thing is that all the criminologists who have looked at this, and these are across the board, I mean, if there's contrary evidence, I'm open to it, have said that as soon as you take a drug mule or a dealer or a street corner guy off the street, he's replaced immediately. So you may feel good about that, but you're not reducing crime with that. And I just think there's no way around that. And I'm looking for data and evidence that suggests that these have been helpful in reducing crime. If the argument is that more prison has helped reduce crime, there are tons of studies that have said the crime rate that dropped for 25 years through the 90s and 2000s, there was a portion of it that was certainly attributable to greater reliance on prisons. No one has given that credit, though, to mandatory minimums, and nor should they.
Mr. Leitzer, last
Well, there's
response for you, and then we'll have one from
Yeah,
Mr. Ring before we go to viewers'
there's
questions.
different studies, and I'm sure that Kevin believes that his studies are accurate, and I've looked at others and disagree with what he's saying. This idea that we're prosecuting drug mules or street corner dealers is just fallacious. That's not what we do in the federal government. We're looking at major traffickers who are making millions of dollars selling drugs. The AUSA in Washington, if he did as you said, he committed a serious violation, and my guess is he will be fired for having done so if he actually withheld exculpatory evidence. The Department of Justice.
So are we saying that the lower level drug dealers are usually left to the states as an individual? And you're talking about purely big time dealers, traffickers. Is that what we're...
We try to focus our limited resources, such as they are at the federal level, on going after international drug traffickers and interstate drug traffickers. One of the beauties of the federal system is that in the federal system we have jurisdiction countrywide, as opposed to each state is limited by its borders. So we often work with state and locals to go after the major traffickers because we have that jurisdictional benefit.
Okay.
I got to say, these aren't my studies or aren't my facts. The United States Sentencing Commission issues a guidebook at the end of every year, in which case they catalog the prosecutions from the year before. So the idea that less than 8% of drug offenders who were sentenced in 2015 were either leaders, supervisors, managers, or otherwise, had a leadership role in their conspiracy is not my number. And the fact that 83% didn't have a gun or use a gun in their offense is not my statistic. These aren't my facts. And so all I want to say is I have no doubt that their intention is to go after the big guy. But there are so many cases where they're used on lower level offenders. You can look, I'm not going to talk anecdotes, go look at our website and see the cases. And so that's why there's outrage about them. That's why there's bipartisan support in Congress for changing these laws. I know Larry's group opposes this, I appreciate that. But this is not even debated among most people, that these laws need reform.
Kevin, it's certainly debated in the Congress.
Go ahead.
It's certainly debated in the Congress, and the Congress has rejected your proposals for the last 3 or 4 years. And this idea that everybody in the federal system is serving a mandatory minimum, by the Sentencing Commission's own statistic, is not the case. It's about 13.4% of federal prisoners are actually serving mandatory minimum sentences. And those are the folks who didn't meet the safety valve, who didn't cooperate, and trafficked in significant amounts of heroin or cocaine or crack or methamphetamine. And they earned the sentence they got, according to the Congress.
And Larry's not going to hear me say, and I don't like when people on my side of this argument talk about somebody walking on the street with 2 joints and they think that the U.S. attorneys are trying to put those people in jail. I know that's not true. I'm not talking about that. But in terms of the safety valve, which he has mentioned, that some low-level offenders are used to escape from mandatory minimums, you really can't have any criminal history. So you can have a 20-year-old state conviction for anything, minor. It gets you, once something that gets you in trouble once, you don't qualify for the safety valve anymore. Okay. And so that's why Congress is looking at renewing that. And I agree that in an election year, Congress did not pass sentencing reform, but I think he knows that they were strong supporters for it, and that's why they were working so actively against it. I respect that. This is why state after state across the country is either repealing or reforming their mandatory minimum sentences. Louisiana, which is the largest incarcerating state in this country and who has mandatory minimums forever, just repealed their drug mandatory minimums. Texas is not a soft on crime state. Texas has no mandatory minimums for drugs. Somehow they are able to deal with traffickers and keep their communities safe.
All right, let's take some questions from our viewers. The first one's going to go to Mr. Leitzer, and it comes from Jonathan Pierce, who asks, do you think mandatory minimums encourage criminals to cooperate with investigators?
Absolutely. And that's one of the main reasons why we fought so hard in the Congress to maintain mandatory minimums. It's one of the key things that enables us to move up the drug food chain. So the threat of serving a mandatory minimum is the very incentive that makes these people want to cooperate. And we're glad to have them cooperate. We're glad to have their sentences reduced because they provide substantial assistance.
Mr. Ring, how do you want to respond to that?
Well, there's 2 things. One is that federal crimes that don't carry mandatory minimums have plea rates that in most cases are the same or higher than drug cooperation. So I don't doubt that in many cases that it's effective to threaten somebody. It would be effective if the prosecutor said to somebody, either you plead guilty and cooperate or I'm going to break your arm. You can coerce cooperation with a long prison sentence. I have no question that works, but it's not as if in other cases defendants are still not looking to get a deal that would be lower than they would otherwise face. And so that's why for embezzlement and larceny and a whole host of other federal crimes, the plea rates are the same. I also want to just say that the Obama administration had an initiative starting in 2013 where they used mandatory minimums less often. I know Larry's group opposed that, but the plea rates from 2013 to today, the last 3 years, have gone up in drug cases. So they're not really losing a lot of leverage. The truth is, prosecutors have tons of leverage. Defendants know that the only way to get a deal is to cooperate. And so you don't need mandatory minimums to get that. Otherwise, every state would have it.
Okay, let's go to Lori Maxwell, who has her question for Mr. Ring, and it is, do you believe mandatory minimums have a deterrent effect? Which I believe you've said no, but we'll give us your answer.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't think they do. And I think this isn't my opinion. We've had mandatory minimums, as Larry said, they've been on the books forever. We had them in the 60s when crime started to rise. And it was Mr. Law and Order, the toughest, the man who declared war on crime, Richard Nixon, who signed legislation repealing federal drug mandatory minimums in 1970. So then we didn't have them. Then they came back in the 80s. But now we've had them, the states have had them, but I'll just focus on the federal system, as Larry wants. They've studied them. They know. We have data now. We don't have to guess, and we don't have to guess about what human nature is. They're not an effective deterrent in drug cases because, one, most of the time people don't even know they exist. You can't be deterred by something you don't know that exists. And second, we just simply know that it's the swiftness and certainty of punishment. It's the fear of being caught. It's why more cops on the street, more prosecutors are helpful and a better solution than longer mandatory sentences. And so I don't think this is, I know we're disputing and I don't mean to sort of hide the ball with studies. People can look that up and look to see what the deterrent effect is of drug mandatory minimums on crime.
Okay, and now it's time for Answer This, where each guest asks a question directly to the other. Who'd like to go first? Kevin, why don't you go first?
I was going to ask a state question, but now I'm not going to.
I'm not a state prosecutor.
I guess I would just ask Larry, we've had mandatory minimum drug laws at the federal level since 1986 was the first round, 1988. Drug use has not been decreased at all. And we now have an epidemic on our hands. How in the world is this solution working?
Well, I think it's working as best as it can. And can you imagine what it would be like if we weren't incarcerating these significant traffickers and putting in jail for significant periods of time? So, the solution to this problem isn't on the shoulders exclusively of law enforcement and our federal statutes. The solution to this problem is when our society finally comes to the realization that we need to stop consuming these kinds of products that destroy people, kills people, 60,000 last year alone. So until we as a society somehow come to grips with this problem, we're going to continue to have sanctions and mandatory minimum tools to enable us to stem the tide, at least. Can you imagine what it would be like if we didn't have these rules?
Okay, and your question to Mr. Ring.
Yeah, Kevin, I think we both can agree that drugs are a curse on our society. They destroy many, many lives. Don't you believe that the mother and father of a drug victim, either through death or through just living a life that's been diminished because of their addiction, would gladly pay the money to incarcerate somebody that provided that drug to that to that person and that family in order to avoid him or her doing it to other families? It's worth the price, don't you think?
Yeah, in many cases, I think that's true. You're not going to hear me make an argument that it is better not to lock up people who we know are going to go out and kill people. I mean, that's not my argument. The problem is, you also have victims, parents who will say that they were sold drugs by a fellow addict. That's in the federal system too. And they don't want another life to be destroyed by spending 20 years. There's 20-year mandatory minimum where death results, where prosecutors act as if it's a murder when it's an addict sharing drugs with someone else. And when victims' parents say they don't want that person, the prosecutor's allegiance to the victim's desires disappear. I mean, victims, when they want punitive or longer sentences, prosecutors cite them. When they want shorter sentences or treatment, prosecutors do not cite them. But again, it's not about individual cases. It's about what works overall, what reduces drug crime overall. And again, if I thought mandatory minimums did that, as opposed to more apprehension and treatment and other means, I would support them. I just don't think that this is a solution that works. And the fact that one person sells a drug and we want to hammer that person, I just think it's just a small piece of this larger puzzle.
All right, and now it's time for We Agree, where each guest names something the other said that he agrees with. Who would like to start on this segment? I think you started last time. We'll have Kevin start this time.
Well, this is an easy one. I mean,
That's good.
I think that there are some people who support reform of the criminal justice system who don't want people to go to prison at all. And they think we don't need punishment and accountability for people who harm others. And I don't agree with that. I agree with Larry that I think that people need to be held accountable, that they should go to prison in many cases where they have hurt others. And so, I just want to say that. I mean, I think prosecutors, for the most part, are trying to do the right thing. And but we just disagree about what is the best way to arrive at a proportionate sentence in each case.
Mr. Leiser, what do you agree with?
And Kevin and I agree that there should be proportionate and fair and just sentences. And our present system isn't perfect, but we do, Kevin, you do acknowledge that we do have the safety valve. We do have downward departures for substantial assistance. And prosecutors are trying to have the punishment fit the crime, as in the Mikado, as best as we can. But we have to abide by the will of the Congress. When the Congress says, if you have this amount of drugs, you're to charge this particular crime, unless you meet the safety valve or unless you provide substantial assistance, our hands are tied, unless there's some injustice that we perceive that's extraordinary, and then we need supervisory review.
Okay, that's all we have time for. We'd like to thank Lawrence Leiser of National Association of Assistant U.S. Attorneys and Kevin Ring of Families Against Mandatory Minimums for joining us to discuss this issue. And thank you for watching Scholars Mate. I'm Simon Harrington, and we'll see you next time.